July 23, 2002. In the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, it is unbearably hot. Local residents are saved only by air conditioners. One 75-year-old man closes all the windows and doors in his apartment. He crosses out a day in the calendar and turns off the air conditioner. Then he goes into the bathroom, takes a .38 caliber pistol, puts it in his mouth, and pulls the trigger. Before the police, his body was found by flies. For 6 days, they fed on the flesh of this man. On the 7th day, his neighbor started complaining about the unbearable smell coming from the man's apartment. The landlord of the apartment, who rented it out to a certain Joseph Newton Chandler III, went inside and was speechless with horror. He did not hesitate to call Chandler's face decomposed almost beyond recognition, and fingerprints could not be removed at all. Because of the unbearable smell, the detectives, who arrived at the scene among the first, were forced to use gas masks. The victim was lying in the fetal position. His face was black, and thousands of maggots were crawling all over his body. His height was 170 centimeters, weight 73 kilograms. His hair is gray, and there is a slight bald spot on his head. The eyes are gray. He wore thick walnut-colored glasses. There were bloodstains on his t-shirt, trousers, and shoes. The man was lying face down on the gun. 3 months earlier, Chandler had bought a pistol at a nearby store for $263.55. He had colon cancer, most likely the 4th stage. Perhaps it was because of this that he chose this fate for himself, instead of letting the disease slowly and painfully devour his body. The bullet fired by his revolver cut through the skin, tore a muscle, and shattered a bone in just a fraction of a second. There was an exit hole in the top of his skull. It was not easy to notify his next of kin about the tragedy. There were no photos of family members or friends in his apartment. There were no letters and messages from the past. There were no contacts in the address book. In the apartment rental agreement, the sister's address was listed as an emergency contact. However, when trying to find someone at this address, it turned out that an empty plot of land in the city of Columbus was listed under it. There was no sister. This man didn't leave a suicide note. And who would he have written it to? The social security number of Joseph Newton Chandler III was listed on his driver's license, which was in his wallet. There one could find at least some information about his reclusive life. Joseph was 65 years old. He was born in Buffalo, New York. His father was Joseph Newton Chandler's sister, and her mother's name was Ellen Cobber. Both parents have already passed away. He had $82,000 in his bank account, but no will was drawn up. This meant that the money would go to the Ohio state budget if one of the closest relatives did not appear. So lawyers began to restore the broken branches of his family tree. A few months passed, and finally a genealogist discovered the Cobber family, who moved from New York to California. Then he managed to track down Helen Cobber's niece, who helped fill in the blanks. It turned out that in the 20s of the last century, Helen married Joseph's sister. On the 11th of March, 1903 years ago, their son was born. He was named Joseph Newton Chandler on December 21, 1945. A car accident occurred in the city of Sherman, Texas, in which Joseph Newton Chandler III died. He was only 8 years old. It all started as the most ordinary suicide. Nothing foreshadowed the presence of crime. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. And then the detectives had a lot of questions. The detectives wondered why this person stole someone else's identity. Was he on the run or hiding from someone? There must have been something unusual behind the whole story. In 1978, in Rapid City, South Dakota, Chandler applied for a copy of his birth certificate in the name of Joseph Newton Chandler III. He probably lived there at that time. He later used the copy of his birth certificate he received to obtain a Social Security number. At that time, the government issued Social Security cards only to adults, so it was not difficult to steal a child's identity. Maybe he knew the real Chandler's family from Texas, or maybe he read about the car crash in the newspaper, but who was he really? This question is quite difficult to answer. Chandler worked as an electrician designer and draftsman for Lubrizol, a chemical company headquartered in Wickliffe, Ohio, and before that had several jobs in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Philadelphia. However, he never talked to colleagues about his private life. He hardly talked to anyone at all. He was a loner. Chandler's studio apartment, where he had lived since 1986, had a small kitchen and a living area with a pull-out bed. There were homemade gadgets in the apartment. For example, an automatic channel switch that worked in such a way that when advertising was turned on, it switched the TV to another channel. There were lenses from foreign cameras. A few items of clothing in the closet, empty vitamin jars, and a calendar in which Chandler crossed out the days until his death. Chandler's appearance also did not give the police any answers to their questions. He had a small scar on his stomach, most likely the consequences of a hernia removed. He had a slight bald spot, which is often found in men of his age. Maybe he was wearing a wig. There were no tattoos, birthmarks, or any other distinguishing features on his body. The police tried to take fingerprints from Chandler's revolver, but they turned out to be smeared. One of the officers recalled that in his nearly 30 years of work, Chandler was the only person who could not be identified in their police department. In the end, the FBI joined the case, who considered Chandler a criminal. I always thought he was on the run. He did a good job, says U.S. Marshal Peter J. Elliott. The feds, as well as the employees of the local police department, could not find enough evidence to find out more about this mysterious man. For example, the computer in Chandler's apartment was smashed because someone accidentally dropped it during an investigation. Some private detectives who worked on the case reported that Chandler searched the internet for information about Nazis and plastic explosives. And so I had to work with what I had. Chandler had read books about getting rich quick. We managed to trace the registration number of his car. The Ohio Department of Transportation had no record of Chandler until 1999. Also, this person watched old episodes of the documentary series America with Most Wanted. There was nothing to cling to. Investigators began to look at unsolved missing persons cases. At first they believed that Chandler was John William Maigret, who escaped from a psychiatric clinic and killed his family in New Hampshire in 1960, George Bugger, who disappeared in New Jersey in 1964, or Crawford, who electrocuted his pregnant wife and 3 children to death in Australia in 1970. However, DNA examination and comparison of dental casts refuted each of these assumptions. Or maybe he simply ran away from his wife, who has not yet been found. At times, Chandler's behavior was peculiar. He could watch TV for several hours without moving. He memorized zip codes, but couldn't remember his birthday. One day, he went to a store in Maine, which was more than 1,000 kilometers from his home. But I came back only because there were no free parking spaces. Another time, he went to a Halloween party dressed as Al Capone and didn't talk to anyone all night. His colleagues called him very strange. One day, he said to one of them, "One day I want to tell you something." But he didn't tell me anything. It was one of the few conversations with his participation. After listening to the recordings of Chandler's phone conversations, It turned out that a couple of months before his death, he called a woman in Texas. It turned out that this woman had no idea who he was. So maybe that's how he was looking for his daughter. Maybe he escaped from an evil cult or committed a terrible crime. Chandler has been researched in some detail on the internet. One of the active users of the Reddit.com site says so about this case. I think this man really had a dark past. Most likely, he is not a serial killer nicknamed the Real Night Hunter, Zodiac, or D.B. Cooper. But I believe that his identity is connected with some other unsolved mystery. If you are ready to do anything to start a new life, then you are definitely running away from something very serious, says James Renner, the author of the novel The Man Primrose Lane, the plot of which is partly based on the story of Joseph Newton Chandler III. Rayner wonders if Chandler was an old spirit who moved from one city to another without arousing suspicion. The way he skillfully changed his name and moved to a new place makes me think he was a spy. Lubrizol employees said that Chandler was paranoid. He often disappeared, sometimes for several days. One day, he told one of his colleagues that his pursuers were getting closer and closer to him. Who were these people? Maybe he was hiding from the mafia. Studying the medical records of Chandler Renner attracted one case in 1989. Chandler arrived at the hospital in Willoughby, Ohio, with lacerations on his penis. He told the doctors that he cut himself trying to masturbate with a vacuum cleaner. But he could also deceive doctors. Perhaps someone tortured him, or perhaps, given his love of inventions, he created some kind of device to satisfy carnal pleasures. It would seem, why hide from doctors? But the fact is that he constantly lied to everyone. One day he told a colleague that he had married a Catholic. Another time he said that he married a Cuban woman who used him to get to the United States in his life. It was difficult to distinguish truth from fiction. In the year 2016, there was a breakthrough in the case of Joseph Newton Chandler III. Forensic scientist Colin Fitzpatrick, who helped solve another case of identity theft of one of the women, compared the chromosome data with data taken from the genetic genealogy database. There was one coincidence. Chandler's real last name was Nichols. This information was picked up by the media and trumpeted about it. However, it was not possible to find out the name of this mysterious Nichols. After all, there were thousands of people with this surname in the country. His surname suggests Russian origin. Maybe during the Cold War, he did something illegal and decided to disappear. In order to solve this case, Fitzpatrick collaborated with the author Margaret nonprofit organization DNA Project. With the help of this organization, the genomes of unidentified people were checked to find out their name. Fitzpatrick tells, Chandler's DNA has already gone through 2 stages of sequencing. An excellent team is working on his case, which analyzes his genetic information to find out who he is. Plunging into the study, the scientists found connections with a couple of Alpha and Silas Nichols, who lived at 1823 Center Street, the one that Chandler himself pointed out that his sister allegedly lived there. And finally, the secret of Chandler's identity was revealed. As it turned out, Alf and Silas, who had long since died, had 4 sons. 3 of them were already dead. But the information about the 4th son, whose name was Robert Ivan Nichols, was cut off starting in the second half of the 60s. In the spring of 2000 of the 17th year, Marshall Elliott, along with another Marshall, found Nichols' son. Investigators showed him a photo in the hope of identifying the mysterious man. As soon as I saw the photo, I recognized him, said his son named Philip Nichols. It turned out that Robert Ivan Nichols served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He was seriously injured during the Japanese bombing of the destroyer Aaron Ward. He returned from the war with the Purple Heart Award and burned his military uniform on his return. He was married and had 3 children. He filed for divorce and left his wife in 1964 year, telling her finally, "The time will come, and you will find out why." The last I heard from Nichols was a letter that he sent to Philip in 1965. It had a California postmark on it. And there was 1 penny inside the envelope. There was no more news from him. Later, in 1965 year, the family wrote a statement to the police about a missing person. In the records of the US Tax Service, there is evidence that the man worked under his real name until 1976 year. According to authorities, neither Nichols nor Chandler had a criminal record. However, this person could move to a new place of residence at any time, and a packed suitcase was always kept in his apartment. Until Detective Elliott solves this case, the case files will be on his desk. There are only a few items in these materials: a death certificate, a coroner's report, and one of 3 known images of the man. A photo of his driver's license, taken 3 years before his death, as well as 2 photos from Halloween parties, where he dressed as Al Capone. At the moment, one of the 2 secrets in this case, namely the secret of his identity, has been revealed. The second mystery remains unsolved. What did he hide from all his life, and why did he decide to commit suicide in the end? In the photo from the driver's license, he looks at the lens. His face is covered with wrinkles, his gaze is heavy. Lips are dry. He's old and frail. Nothing like an 8-year-old boy. And perhaps one day we will be able to find the answer to the second riddle of Joseph Newton Chandler III.